All right. Now I'd like to welcome to the show Carrie Conko. She's the Senior Vice President of the State Policy Network. Welcome to Free the Economy, Carrie.
Hey, thanks, Richard. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, here on the show, we've covered many state policymaking topics and interviewed some great people from state-based think tank, including one of my favorites, Brooke Medina of the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina. She was on episode 16.
Awesome. Excellent.
And but we've never gone in depth on the State Policy Network itself. So if you could
Okay.
give listeners just a quick pitch on the history, the mission.
A quick pitch. Well, we've been around for over 30 years, so I don't know how quick the history would be. But State Policy Network was founded by Tom Rowe. Tom Rowe was a businessman in South Carolina. And I love this story because it really, to me, solidifies the need for good ideas to drive policy. Tom Rowe was a supporter of Ronald Reagan. And when Reagan went into the White House, as many people know in Washington, the Heritage Foundation was there for him and basically handed him the playbook, right? Of here's the policies and prescriptions you can follow as you're setting up the White House and the policies that you'll be proposing going forward. And that was huge, right? That's, we all know the history of Heritage and Ronald Reagan and the influence they had in his policies. But Reagan was also a governor, right? So he was the governor of California, and Tom Rowe had a think tank in South Carolina. And Reagan basically said, hey, why don't we have more think tanks in the States? And you should do something about that. So Tom Rowe was a businessman, and he decided, yeah, we do need to do that. We do need a think tank in every state. So that was basically the impetus for State Policy Network. So, 30 plus years later, we have 64 state-based think tanks, and SPN's mission is to build and catalyze that freedom movement in the states, anchored with state-based think tanks. So that's sort of the quick and dirty history of State Policy Network and how we came to be.
That's excellent. And I know so, and you have a history working in communications in particular.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so when it comes to taking this message of, free markets and limited government, things like that, out into the rest of the world, it reminds me of an old quotation that is sometimes attributed to Frederick Bastiat. I haven't done
Right.
the deep dive to verify this, but it is frequently attributed
Okay.
to Bastiat, where he said the
Right.
worst thing that can happen to a good cause is not to be skillfully attacked, but to be ineptly defended.
Yes.
And so I think, do you feel like that's the case with politics and public policy? And is that sort of a heavy burden for people who decide to work in this field, that if we fall down on the job defending our ideas, that's almost worse than people attacking them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge of the free market movement in general is that, I think we tend to be very logical people. And the logic of free markets and the benefits of free markets make a lot of sense to us, right? If I've always been amazed that when I came into this world, there's a lot of lawyers, obviously, there's a lot of engineers who come into this world, a lot of scientists, and all of those folks tend to make a lot of decisions based upon data and the information in front of us, and that basically communicates to us not only the features of freedom, the features of liberty, the features of free markets, but also the benefits that automatically sort of computes in our very logical brains. Alas, most of Americans and most people in the world are not like that. We make decisions based upon a lot of things. We make decisions based upon the values that we hold dear. So it's the job of the sort of advocates of free market to not just talk about the features of freedom and the features of free markets, but to talk about what those benefits are and how that computes. So, very basically, right, you want to talk about, I always say the basic one is, people often say, the reason we want to lower taxes is we want to put more money in your pockets. Okay, that's great. But what does that actually mean to a real person? More money in your pocket also means the benefits of more choice and control over your lives. It means the opportunity to invest that money in ways that matter to your family, because we hold our family, right? We hold that as a core value. We hold the future of our children as a core value. So having money in your pocket and the ability to, provide for your children and make their lives better, those are, benefits to freedom. And then there's another piece of it, which is, sort of the psychosocial benefits that you also have to hit on, right? Is that, that means security, right? That gives you the benefit of knowing that you can plan for a rainy day. So we just have to do a better job of not just communicating, again, those features of what freedom and free markets mean. We also have to make the extra mile and help people compute, right? That they need to see the benefits, and then what that means for them, even beyond that, what that means for them, just like, in that psychosocial space.
Yeah, that really reminds me of some work that CEI's founder Fred Smith has done over the years.
Mm-hmm.
What he
Yep.
calls value-based communications,
Yep.
and also what our research fellow here at CEI, Josh Bandog, who was with us for about a year and a half and is
Yep.
now going to a SPN affiliate group, the Illinois Policy Institute. He's just started over there.
Yep.
He's writing a whole book about this
Yep.
sort of stuff, and so we're excited about where that's going to go, and how we're, I think, going to be able to communicate better with a lot of people about how some of these policies that seem sort of technocratic, technical in
Mm-hmm.
general, actually have a deep connection to the things they care about most. And on one of our recent episodes, I forget which one, we also covered the topic of polling and this question about are Americans, or sometimes young people specifically, are they
Mm-hmm.
becoming uh, more attuned to socialism versus capitalism,
Right.
young people today, they
Mm-hmm.
love socialism, and they're not into free market and capitalism. And one, there's a question about what people of different generations think of when they think of socialism, right? If you grew up in my generation, when I was watching the Soviets invade the United States during in Red Dawn, one of the greatest Cold War movies, your vision of what socialism is a little bit different if you were a campaign volunteer for AOC in New York. um,
Mm-hmm.
so but even putting aside those sort of different perceptions of what socialism even really means, it's interesting that if you sort of break it down into more specific things, you actually get uh, very different results. So if you ask even young people, like, what's your impression of socialism, it's sort of alarmingly high for some of us. But if you ask them, what's your impression of small business and entrepreneurship, it's much higher,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think that shows that what people don't have, they don't have this kind of detached intellectual idea of about, like, I'm in love with Marxist theory, right?
Right.
What they're in love with, the idea is sort of opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so when you have people saying, oh well, we're rating our approval of entrepreneurship and small business at like 85%, that's
Mm-hmm.
stratospherically high. That's the highest
Yeah.
of anything you want to poll, Congress, the
Mm-hmm.
president, clergy, military, teachers, anything in American society. That's among the highest you can get for anything you could possibly name. So that's both kind of a warning and kind of reassuring in some ways, that even when you see poll results that seem hostile to markets in a free society, I think what is really happening is people are seeing a core value that they have be threatened. And I think
Mm-hmm.
we can both craft policies and explain policies in a way that say, no, actually, this is good for you, this is good for your family, and it
Right.
doesn't need to threaten your idea of what you think is important, safety, equality, fairness, those things.
Yeah. I mean, I 100% agree. The idea, and I appreciate that you actually said fairness, right? And that's, I always appreciate Arthur Brooks, right, who I think makes, some of the best cases for free markets and free enterprise when he talks. And one of the things he says is that, that is the system that has lifted the most people out of poverty, right? And that's fact. But the brilliant framing of that is that it also reminds people that it's fair, right? It's, we don't see fairness in systems of crony capitalism. Absolutely, crony capitalism is not good, but capitalism, fair, right? It is fair. So I love that you did touch on that. Fairness is one of those core values, and that's what young people, very often when you talk to them, we have an 18-year-old son. Those are the things he's concerned about. He wants to see that the system is not rigged, and it is fair. And that's often, Competitive Enterprise Institute has been at the center of that for a long time. It's making that sure that the system isn't rigged and that it is fair.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the concern that, and again, this is sort of another issue that's come up in previous episodes here, is that
Mhm.
we don't try and pretend that the system as it exists now is perfect, right? Just
Right.
be, if someone says, well, we don't like capitalism, we want a socialist system, and I might say, well, I don't think that would be an improvement. That
Mhm.
doesn't mean that I'm defending the system we have now is perfect. The system we
Mhm.
have now, I think, is rigged in some ways, but that's
Yeah.
why we need to fix it.
Yes. Yeah. I think, another, great communicator is Russ Roberts. And when I worked with him at Mercatus, Russ was always great about saying is that, yeah, free markets fail, but I would still choose markets because they are the fairest system, right? And that's and I'm paraphrasing, I'm probably butchering it, but that I always thought was a really wise way of looking at, our case for markets, right? It needs to recognize that, yeah, it's not perfect. I think a lot of people spend time communicating um, without acknowledging that there are failures. And when that happens, what that comes across as is untruthful, right? And a big part of communicating the ideas, especially around public policy issues, is that you have to gain trust with people, right? You have to have credibility. So when you leave sort of the warts and the negative off to the side and completely ignore it and act as if it didn't happen, that undermines credibility and it undermines trust. So we do have to be mindful that there are failures to the system, and you have to acknowledge them and you have to address them.
Well, yeah, and I think it certainly, it falls back in our court, especially to point out where there is cronyism, where it's
Mm-hmm.
this is the combination of profit seeking people and sort of favored dispensing
Mm-hmm.
politicians, maybe in their minds with the best of intentions, perhaps not the best of intentions. Ultimately, I don't I don't think it matters. But American people are inherently suspicious about big organizations that they don't feel like they have any control over, and big business and
Mm-hmm.
big government are two of those. But
Right.
ultimately, it's up to the government to grant those favors or not, to give those handouts or not, to give those subsidies or not. If I'm the CEO of a corporation, I could beg and plead and whine about wanting to get subsidies all day. I, on my own, don't have any power to get any of that. I can't grab that taxpayer money. Only politicians and policymakers can give it away. And yet I feel like sometimes when we look at these sort of corrupt situations where some company gets $1 billion, economic development grant or something, program, tax abatements, things, we say like, oh well, we're only mad at the company. It's like, well, you should at least be 50% mad at the government, and actually, I think you should probably be 90% mad at the government because they're the ones who had the choice whether to give your taxpayer money away or not, right? Like the greedy companies asked for it, and sure, they certainly wanted it, but they couldn't have done any of that on their own. Only the government could have given it away.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. I mean, when it comes to it, right? If the rats are always going to take the cheese. We're not calling the companies rats, but of course, if you set up the institutions so that they can be gained and they can be rigged, of course they're going to go for it. That's it's in their interest. That's people act within we know that people act within their self interest. Um, but I also believe that people can act in ways that are beneficial to the community. And capitalism is about that, right? You have to be able to create value for somebody else in order for them to buy your good. And if you're not creating value, people aren't going to buy your goods. Um, so yeah, I mean, I do think that there is an opportunity for us to do a better job of communicating the value that people can get out of our ideas and our policies. 100%.
Well, we also often talk about the fact that we have, a federal system of government. We have 50 different state
Mm-hmm.
governments, and a lot of those,
Mm-hmm.
unlike in some other countries, our states actually have quite a bit of independent policymaking authority on various areas. And so we call that, the laboratory of democracy. So when
Right.
one state does something good and they get good results, then that, other states can learn and copy that success. But the big question is, are we learning at least as well as we
Mm-hmm.
should be? Where
Right.
where is the on the Carrie thermometer? Are we seeing a lot of states picking up good policy reforms and them spreading across the country, or are they or the state legislatures kind of like, are they asleep at the wheel? How good are we doing?
Well, I would say, there's a couple things. So one, back to your conversation earlier about sort of how people are feeling about institutions. Um, One of the things that SPN has been tracking, we do a monthly poll called State Voices. You can see it at spn.org, State Voices. And what we look at is trust in institutions. And the American people, not surprising, there was a sort of loss of trust in big institutions, especially the federal government, from the beginning of COVID straight through today. I mean, actual trust is probably in the 28s. I was looking at it the other day. Lack of trust or do not trust at all is in, between 40 and 45 and 50. So that's, bad news for how people feel about Washington and what we get out of the feds. On the other hand, people tend to trust their state and local governments more. And that's good news for groups like State Policy Network and our affiliates, because that, I think, has opened the window for some really good reforms. So you asked about, am I optimistic, I guess, about what's going on in the states? And that's why I'm at State Policy
Mhm.
Network, is because, having worked in Washington and having to work with Washington policymakers for such a long time when I was at Mercatus, I was really getting discouraged by what was happening in Washington, because they just weren't changing. It doesn't move fast. It doesn't change, and maybe that's a feature and not a bug, because that does slow down bad policies. However, in the states, especially around education reform coming out of COVID, we've seen a lot of really good reforms happening. So, education savings accounts happening in states like Utah, in West Virginia, in Arizona. That's really exciting. Even a Democratic governor, although he seems to be backing out, is also looking at education savings accounts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that's really exciting. There's been changes in regulation around education, so freeing up more entrepreneurs to get into spaces so that they're doing things like small schools, pods, charters, etc. So I think that's really exciting, and the hope is, of course, that those reforms, starting at the state level, they spread state to state, community to community, and there's a call for them, and then you see change at the federal level. Um, so I am optimistic about what's happening in the states. I think it's pretty exciting.
Great, because we just had Ed Tarnowski from Ed Choice, the school
Yeah,
choice
great. Yeah.
group founded by Rosa Milton Friedman,
Hmm.
who was our guest, and I just saw those a lot of great people down at Freedom Fest. We'll give a plug for
Hmm.
the annual
Hmm.
conference, Freedom Fest, which many people might know. For many years, it was hosted in Las Vegas, Nevada. It was now in Memphis, Tennessee, just last week.
Hmm.
And there were uh, so Freedom Fest is sort of a libertarian conference, and it has all kinds of
Hmm.
different, interesting, fascinating, crazy people get together, including some groups like the ones we're talking about, public policy
Hmm.
groups. SPN had a booth there. It was
Yep.
very popular, um, and
Good to hear.
Ed Choice was there, and some of our other friends from the free market movement. In addition to many opportunities to invest in gold and oil exploration, so those were there as well. Classic,
They always
classic.
are.
Um, and so we've seen, I've seen, even this is not even an issue I work that much on, but I've seen a lot of news about, just like you said, education, school choice reforms
Hmm.
going on in all kinds of states, including states where you might not have originally expected them. But then I've I've also been hearing a little bit about, and maybe this is not the past 6 months, maybe this is the past few years, occupational licensing reform, like big picture, sort of regulatory reform in general. I think Idaho had a big um, effort there, and then another thing that came up at the conference on our 1A tax panel was Grover Norquist and Daniel Bunn were both there, big tax people in DC, and they were pointing out how a lot of states have been lowering taxes, or or are, as Grover said, on the sort of glide path to eliminating income taxes, sort of lowering it, or having more flat taxes rather than a bunch of different brackets. And so uh, those, I'm sure there are probably some trends that are less encouraging, but those all seem to be ones that came up as uh, none of these states is necessarily reinventing anything from scratch, but we have several that are sort of kind of in a slow herd trending in more or less the right direction, which is maybe as much as we could hope for on some of these topics.
Absolutely. And I think the other good thing about those is when you look at the polling on these issues, a lot of the American people are with us. I think the trick for us will be is like once you get these reforms, the important thing is to keep reminding people what the benefits of those reforms are being for them. So it's not enough to pass education savings accounts. We have to keep making the case to people that here's how these are helping you, helping students in your community, and helping build up a stronger community.
So so there's one new publication that was just released, and maybe you've seen this. This is a ranking published by CNBC about the best states to do business in. So a lot of publications come out with these all the time, ranking the 50
Right.
states. And uh, many of the states that we traditionally consider as great to do business in, states like Texas and Florida, rank near the bottom of this particular new CNBC ranking. And one thing, and of course, this is controversial, so a bunch of people have, started also writing critiques of it already. And one thing the critics of the rankings have pointed out is that among, there's all sorts of things potentially to critique because it's a pretty complicated methodology between all the things they
Right.
weighted. But among other things, that a lot of the states that are at the top of the ranking, they're supposedly the best states to do business in, like Massachusetts and Minnesota, are actually losing residents. And in many cases, businesses as well. Again, another thing we talked about on a previous episode, Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks not just individuals and households, but businesses moving state to state in and out, and net migration. And the states that supposedly at the very bottom, Texas, I believe, was dead last in this, are actually gaining residents and business activity and new businesses and new and hiring and workers moving in. So, uh, I wonder what your sort of take on this in general is. To like pick apart the like methodology, but does it make sense to invent this kind of like elaborate theory about what states are best for business when you have real life data that
Mhm.
already shows you?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I always find indexes sort of a valuable tool, right? But you have to take them in the context of all of the other measurements that are out there. And I think where I learned that the first time where it really stuck was when I was with Mercatus and we were looking at Gulf Coast recovery after Hurricane Katrina. And there were lots of indexes. People were trying to decide is New Orleans back? Is Louisiana back after Katrina? And there would be an index on how many people are receiving mail, and they'd say, oh yes, this neighborhood is back because these people are receiving mail. But what we found when we'd go on the ground, and I thought that was important, right? That the closer you can get to the activity to understand what's actually happening, you're going to get better data. Um, people sitting in Washington just looking at the numbers and saying, look, here's the number of postal boxes that are reopened in communities. But then you'd go on the ground and you'd see vacant neighborhoods. You wouldn't see children outside playing, right? You'd see houses that were still in the process of being built. And, maybe somebody was living in a trailer outside the house and yeah, they were picking up mail, but their family was still in Houston
Right.
or, still in Atlanta. They weren't back. New Orleans was not back because the mail was, being delivered. So I tend to approach a lot of indexes with skepticism because they're, it's just one of many data points. It's the same with polling and market research, right? You need to look at, you need to be really careful about, how that information has been collected, who's been part of that conversation, when did you ask them about it? There's all kinds of factors that go into indexes and polling that, I think you just need to be careful.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I might put together my 10 best business indexes and CNBC
Mhm.
might just be at the bottom. We don't know.
Right, there you go. There
Um,
you go.
the best places to do business index, meta index coming
Yeah,
soon.
I mean, I think it just speaks to, we all have to be careful consumers of information. And I think, I think that's one of the other interesting things I was just looking at. Again, the trust index that we've been doing, and people keep talking about how dangerous social media is to people's interpretations of the world today. But people get that they shouldn't trust social media. It's not trusted.
Mhm.
However, I don't even approach that number with skepticism, because the question is, they might not trust social media overall, but they might trust theirs a heck of a lot. So
Mhm.
there's, we have to be careful about how we, again, what's the question, how people have answered it, and how we need to interpret the data.
Yes. Now, the one thing that's interesting about to me about an organization like SPN is the sort of the way it's
Mhm,
structured. So in one sense, it's sort of a normal political advocacy and education group, like a lot of others.
mhm,
It's a
mhm,
nonprofit. It gets donations and
mhm.
it does programs. But
I
in
would say
another way, it's
policy advocation, not political advocation, but policy
yes.
advocation. Yes.
But in another way, it's sort of very different because it's sort of at the
Mhm,
center of this like network of other organizations, right? So it's sort
mhm.
of a
Yeah.
convener and
Mhm,
coordinator.
mhm.
But all those organizations are independent. They've got their own boards of directors and they're all their own
Yes.
organizations. Uh, so how does that change your strategy, or how does it like inform your strategy working at sort of any other sort of policy organization versus this one where it's all part of this big network, right? You're not
Mhm.
telling any of your member groups what to do, but
Yes.
you are sort of helping them to do what they want to do, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's what I love about State Policy Network in particular. I've been here for, I think it'll be 7 years in January, and we have a unique position in the freedom movement, in that our role is to help organizations go further faster together, right? You mentioned a big part of what we do is connect people, connect organizations, and we do that with, like you said, independent organizations. So a lot of what we depend upon is, cooperation and collaboration. But that's why I think our organizations appreciate SPN, is because we do help to facilitate that collaboration when we bring people together. And the biggest time we do that is coming up. And I know I saw you were registered. I think I saw a number of people from CEI are coming to SPN's annual meeting in Chicago in August. And that, we'll have, anywhere from 1,300 to 1,500 people in Chicago, and that's, basically our biggest connecting activity, is bringing folks together. And what we do there is, one, we want to work with people, and this is what we do year round, right? But this is the biggest event that we do. We work with people to, one, inspire them, right? We want them to see, like you talked about earlier, what's going on in other states, so they can pick up good policy ideas or good strategies and take them back and try them out in their own states. Um, we want them to inspire to go further, right? So we expose them not only to best practices from the states, but we look out into, best practices in marketing and communication in the corporate world. We bring people in. We bring in talent advisors. So last year, we had Deanne Turner, who was the human resources vice president at Chick-fil-A for years. And she comes in and talks about how to bring in talent, and how to build culture in your nonprofit. So really about inspiring people. And then we also want them to go out with practical things they can do the next day, right? So that's something SPN, really does try to work on. It's not just, enough to, sit and write white papers and think great ideas and develop policy, but you have to put that into action. So we try to come up with practical ways that people can walk out of SPN's annual meeting and start doing something new and something different day one when they get back to their office. So that's it is a wonderful, unique mission, is that we get to work with people. And that's why, we do talk about going, further, faster together. We feel that when you get people together, it challenges people, it sharpens people, and it inspires them to go further.
Yes, well, I can testify that's absolutely true. I've been to many fine SPN annual meetings over the years, and it's I think it's a great opportunity for me in general, and for other people, say in the Washington D.C. world, where we
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of these sort of groups. But I can only imagine what it's like if you work in sort of a state capital where there are
Mm-hmm.
hardly any other groups like you at all, and
Yes.
you might be
Yeah.
one of the only people working on, your set of issues. To
Mm-hmm.
go to that, like, ballroom where 1,000 people are all, sipping cocktails and having strategic conversations, and sort of feeling reinvigorated by knowing that they're part of like a bigger team and a bigger movement, that I think,
Mm-hmm.
especially for those state-based groups, is really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, we had, SPN's, network of state think tanks. We range from, people who are one person or two person startups. Like we have Opportunity Arkansas, a guy named Nick Horton. I think he has one full-time employee right now. That's a lonely business, right? When you're off in the middle of a state trying to do the work we do, and it's not like working in Northern Virginia or Washington D.C. like you and I do, right? Where we sort of you can throw a rock and hit somebody who you can find for support.
Mhm.
So it's really, we hear that a lot, that the value of the network is when we can convene them and they have that camaraderie and that collaboration opportunity with people like them, who they don't get to see every day, like you and I have
Mhm.
the awesome benefit of being able to do.
All right, Carrie, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. And before we go, where can
Mhm.
people find all the important information about SPN and you? Where are you
Oh,
posting and
well, where am
commenting?
I? Yeah, where am I posting and commenting? Well, I think the easiest way to go is spn.org. That's State Policy Network. So spn.org. You can visit our website and learn more about what we do. And I appreciate this, Richard. This is a great podcast. I took a look at some of your episodes and I'm proud to be part of it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I will see you in Chicago.
See you then. Take care. Bye bye.